This has to do with St Thomas Aquinas. Now,
Okay.
I'm really starting to get into him. I know I've
Mhm.
got a ton more to do to even get close to even scratching the surface. But I was reading something online to where he had been excommunicated, then brought back in and made a saint. And I was wondering if you
Mhm.
can comment on how that's possible. And two, I also was reading that, and some Protestants believe that if he was born just a little bit later in life, or in the timeline, that he would have been part of the Reformation and would have sided with Martin Luther. And I was wondering your opinion on that also.
I would say that's wishful thinking and totally unsupported by the text. St. Thomas Aquinas indicates that he is a very firm believer in Catholic teaching, and I would say that's wishful thinking. I'm also, in general, not a fan of people trying to imagine what someone would have done if they had been born in a different time, because there's no real way to know that. Like, what would I have done if I had been born in 1700 instead of the mid 1960s? Or what would I have done if I had been born in 1813 instead of the mid 1960s? Or what would I do differently if I was born in the year 2400? There's no way to answer those questions. So I think they're basically useless, and people are prone to confirmation bias. We know that. It's a known psychological trait where people seek out evidence that confirms their own preferred views. So what tends to happen is, if you like someone, you want them on your side, and so you would say, oh, if they had just been born in this other circumstance, they would have been on my side, even though they weren't. On the other hand, if you hate someone, let's say Adolf Hitler, and you say, well, what if he was born in the 1700s? Well, he would have been just as bad. Well, you don't know that. People make free will decisions, and you really just cannot predict what someone would do if they were born in a different time. So I view all of this as confirmation bias and wish fulfillment, and useless. When it comes to the excommunication of St. Thomas Aquinas, now, he wasn't excommunicated in his own lifetime. He was excommunicated, but it was after he was dead. He died in the year 1274. And in 1277, the Bishop of Paris issued a series he rejected a bunch of propositions, and these are known as the condemnations of 1277. What had been happening is there had been, due to the translation of the works of Aristotle and various Muslim philosophers like Averroes, for example, Christian theologians who are also philosophers had been interested in all this new literature, and they'd been saying, okay, so what kinds of ideas can we find in this philosophy, whether it's Greek or Muslim, that we can make use of in Catholic thought, because not everything they believe is compatible with the Catholic faith, but some things are. And Aquinas was one of the leaders in this movement. He had the view that all truth is God's truth, and so it doesn't matter if a truth was articulated by Aristotle or if a truth was articulated by Averroes, it's still a truth. And so it can be used as part of Christian philosophy. And so he, among other members of the faculty at the University of Paris, were exploring ideas, but they didn't always get it right. Sometimes they accepted an idea from Aristotle or the Islamic philosophers that was actually not compatible with the Christian faith. In particular, and I should mention, not everyone was comfortable with this approach. There were a lot of Augustinians. Now, Aquinas was a Dominican, but there were a lot of Augustinians who were not at all happy about this influx of Greek and Muslim philosophy into Christian thought. They were Platonists. They wanted things kept the way they were. They didn't want all these newfangled, old-fangled ideas coming into stuff. And so they were very suspicious of some of the propositions that were being advocated by faculty members at the University of Paris. And some of the ideas were just wrong. And so the Bishop of Paris then issued, it's like 219 propositions he rejected. Not all of them were from St. Thomas, but they were being advocated by people who were part of this new philosophical theological movement at the University of Paris. And frankly, he condemned a lot of propositions that needed to be condemned. For example, some of the propositions dealt with what can God do. Now, this is not specific to Aquinas. I'd have to look up what he said on this. But there was a common view that in this philosophical movement, that God could not create other worlds. Now, you have to understand what they meant by that. The way they envisioned the world, they believed that Earth is at the center of the world. This is based on Aristotelian science. They believed Earth is at the center of the world, and it's surrounded by a series of concentric shells on which are embedded the 7 classical planets. That's the sun, because anything that was a moving light in the sky that moved irregularly was a planet. So the sun moved against the background stars, so it's a planet. The moon moved against the background stars, so it was a planet. And then Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And then beyond that was a sphere that the fixed stars, the background stars that make the constellation, that they were on. And so they viewed the universe as a set of concentric spheres that extend out just beyond the orbit of Saturn. And one of the things they noted about what they could observe of the universe is everything up in the sky moves in circles. And so they believed that there are 2 kinds of motion that objects are based on Aristotelian science that objects can have. They can either have linear motion, where an object moves in a straight line, or they can have circular motion, which is like everything up in the heavens. And so they had this understanding of the world, and then they would debate questions like, well, okay, so God made our world that goes out to just beyond the edge of Saturn. Could he make other worlds? Could there be, or in modern language, could there be other universes? And some of these philosophers had a hard time understanding how that would be possible. They thought, well, where would they be? And how would they exist, and how would they move? And would there be vacuums, which Aristotelian science said couldn't exist? Would there be vacuums between these worlds? And so some members of the faculty at the University of Paris said God just can't do this. God is not able to make other worlds, or what we would say other universes, because it would entail these problems. Well, the Archbishop of Paris, to his credit, didn't cotton to the statement God can't. And so he was among the condemnations of 1277 was the idea that God can't make other universes. And in fact, a running theme in the condemnations of 1277 was protecting God's omnipotence, keeping philosophers from saying God can't do this for reason X, Y, or Z. Now, if there's a logical contradiction involved, like making a square circle or a 4-sided triangle, okay, God can't do that because that's just word salad. That's not a real thing. But unless there's a contradiction, God can make all these other things. And so that was a running theme in the condemnations of 1277. What the bishop was trying to do was protect God's freedom. And actually, the condemnations of 1277 are viewed as an important milestone in the history of science, because by protecting God's ability to do stuff, the condemnations allowed people to think realistically about new possibilities that were not envisioned in Aristotelian science. And so these condemnations actually have a notable place in the history of science. Well, a few of the condemnations were for propositions that St Thomas Aquinas had taught. And so after his death, he was excommunicated. So he wasn't when he was alive, but it was acknowledged after he died. He taught some things that contradicted these propositions. But ultimately, he was rehabilitated because and this is in keeping with the fact that today, we just don't judge people for things that were not condemned in their day. Like St. Thomas Aquinas also, he rejected the modern understanding of the Immaculate Conception. He thought that Mary was immaculate by the time her conception ended, but he thought her conception took place over a period of weeks because that's what they thought conception was like back then. They didn't realize it happens in a flash. And so he would not have said that she was free from original sin from the first moment of her conception. And that disagrees with modern church teaching, which says from the first moment of her conception, she was free of original sin. But he's not judged a heretic because this hadn't been mandated in his day. The modern view of the Immaculate Conception was not yet a dogma, and so he's not considered guilty of rejecting a dogma and being a heretic. And in the same way, the propositions of 1277 were not in place when he died in 1274. So he really shouldn't have this stain attached to his memory. We can just acknowledge he was wrong about certain things, but and the church pretty quickly realized that was the case because he was canonized in the mid 1300s. So he didn't have to wait super long for this excommunication to be lifted and his memory to be rehabilitated and actually be declared a saint. So that's what's going on with that.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this Catholic Answer, be sure to like, subscribe, and check out our live streams Monday through Friday, 3 to 5 p.m. Pacific. Or find the episode after on YouTube, your favorite podcast platform, or our Catholic Answers app.